together. So the first thing I want you to do is turn off your cell phones. And just be. Because sometimes we just don't be. I'm from Memphis. So, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's important to our topic tonight. But sometimes it's just good to be together. So I'm really grateful to be together with you. But the first thing I'm going to ask you to do, if you haven't done already, is when you leave here and you turn your cell phone back on, I'm going to ask you to make sure that you are participating in the Parliament of the Jewish people. If you haven't already done so, I want you to vote, and I want you to urge every Jewish person you know, whether they're a member of the synagogue or not, to vote in the World Zionist Congress elections. That's the one that Theodore Herzl helped start back in the late 1800s, because that election is taking place right now. You have the power of the prophets. You can make a difference. And you can live the title of my talk tonight, Doing Justice, Loving Compassion, and Walking Humbly with Your God, by going to the website AZM, AmericanZionistMovement.org, and registering and voting for a strong Israel that will be based on liberty and equality, by voting for ARTSA, the Association of Reformed Zionists of America. You'll be voting for me. I'm number 12 on the slate, and it would be an honor and a privilege to help represent all of you to shape a Jewish democratic Israel, the kind that we as Reformed Jews, as liberal Jews, can be proud of, to help create the kind of Israel that will be more hospitable to Reform and liberal Judaism, an Israel where women and men can pray equally at the Kotel, an Israel that will live up to its promise of equality for all of its citizens. You see, the vote for the World Zionist Congress slates what's at stake: millions and millions of dollars and public policy in the state of Israel. It will all be shaped by our votes. So if you haven't done it yet, or if you say, I don't really, Israel's over there, I'm happy in Houston, I'm not so much of a Zionist, we need you to vote. And I hope that you too will care about creating a democratic state of Israel and care about ensuring Reform Judaism's well-being in the Holy Land. Okay, so now let's talk about living as a prophet here. That's what you can do there. A religious school teacher was teaching a course in the prophets. He had discussed Isaiah and our topic tonight, the words of the prophet Micah. But this week he was focused on the words of another great prophet, the prophet Elijah. I know you all know him as Eliyahu Hanavi. You know, that fellow that comes to your Seder table and drinks a little wine. He comes to every bris. We sing to him at the end of Shabbat, at the end of Havdalah. Eliyahu Hanavi. Well, the Sunday school teacher was carefully explaining the story of Elijah the prophet versus the false prophets of Baal. He explained how Elijah built an altar, carefully gathered the wood and stacked it on the altar, took a big heifer, a steer, cut it up in pieces and laid it on the altar. And then Elijah commanded all of the people there, the people of God, to fill up 4 barrels of water. And they poured the water over the altar. He had them do it 4 separate times with those 4 big barrels. Now, said the teacher, can anyone in the class tell me why the Lord would have Elijah pour water over the steer on the altar? And some of the students just had a blank look, like some of you. But one little girl in the back of the class raised her hand. Oh, I know. She had great enthusiasm. She says, I know why he poured the water on the steer. To make the gravy, came her enthusiasm. So tonight we're not going to make gravy with Elijah, but we are going to talk turkey about the prophets. We're going to talk turkey about social justice and social change, about speaking truth to power, Madam Mayor. We're going to talk about what it means to be a Jewish person of faith, and bringing our tradition to the public square, and how we make that change. It's important to realize that when you talk to politicians, you can correct us if we're wrong, they'll tell you that people from their churches are very good at writing letters, or very good at showing up and saying how they feel. But often, progressive Jewish folks, progressive liberal people of faith, they don't come around as often. Is that true, Ray? So what happens is people get a one-sided view of what religion is, or means. And in our country, we have a good separation of church and state. But that can only happen if both sides of the coin are represented. And so just like the prophets of old, who challenged the political framework of their day, they challenged the perversity of the wealthy who would forget the plight of the poor and of those on the margins. The prophet's words often weren't well received. Poor old Jeremiah, he was thrown in prison. And even the great Isaiah, he ran around naked for 3 years. But the words of these biblical prophets are heroes, our heroes. They inspired me along the way, along with a few people, and it formed a foundation of my own thinking and acting in the world as a Jew. And so tonight I want to share a little bit about that. While our world and our society, our communities need much work, I know I've been called to try and work for a society that lifts up all people. And I and my rabbinate have been gifted with the opportunity to focus on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Ironically, because of time and of circumstance. It's not the only area of my interest or of my commitment to social justice and social change, but it's where I began my work and where I learned how to apply these to other areas. The prophet Micah speaks to me. Not literally, but in the book of Micah, we find in chapter 6, verse 8, my very, very favorite verse of the whole Bible. God has shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does God require of you? Do justice, love compassion, and walk humbly with your God. It's so important to me that on my tally toad, instead of the blessing, I have this verse from the book of Micah. It's so important to me that in my office, painted on one wall on the window that looks out onto the sanctuary, I have this verse from Micah, guiding me as a mission statement every single day, so that I never forget. It's guided me in the course of my own rabbinate, and tonight I want to share with you a bit of the why that is, and why the words of Micah, I think, are the guide for all of us to do the heavy lifting of transformation and transforming our world into a just society. I want to share with you a bit about the journey for LGBT equality in Reform Judaism and how the work in our denomination has influenced not only the rest of Judaism, conservative and now Orthodoxy, but other religions as well. Why even just this very week, the Mormon Church, sponsors of California's notorious Proposition 8, which took away the right of civil marriage in 2008, finally now, thank goodness, they have said they will support anti-discrimination laws for LGBT Americans. It's a huge turnaround. First, a word about the prophet Micah. Who was he? When did he preach? Micah means who is like. As in, the scholars tell us, who is like God. You know, from this week's Torah portion in Veshtalach, we say, Mi hamocha v'aylim Adonai, who is like you among the gods that are worshipped? Micah, who is like you? The prophet's name actually conveys his central and core message. Who is like you? You be like God. Aspire to do holy work in the world. Our Jewish tradition teaches he was a prophet who came from a small rural village called Moreshet Gath in the southwestern area of what was Judea, kind of in between Jerusalem and the area controlled by the Philistines on the coast. He was a contemporary of the greats Isaiah and Hosea and Amos, and Micah was active preaching both in the northern and southern kingdoms. He experienced the devastation brought about by the fall of Samaria and Sennacherib, the Assyrians' invasion of Judah, and he prophesied, the scholars tell us, about 737 to 696, about 150 years before the first temple's destruction by the Babylonians. Now Micah, he often rebuked corruption in city life, both in the northern kingdom of Israel and Judah. His early prophecies, he predicted the destruction of both Samaria and Jerusalem, and the people of Samaria in particular were rebuked for worshiping idols, which were bought with the income earned by questionable people of the night. Micah was the first prophet to predict the downfall of Jerusalem. And according to him, the city was doomed because, now listen, Mayor, the beautification was financed by dishonest business practices, which impoverished the city's citizens. You see, just as in our own time we ought to be worried about income inequality, that was Micah's message over 2,700 years ago. He also called people to account, the other prophets that were charging people for their oracles. You see, corruption knows no generation. Micah rebuked the people of Israel because of dishonesty in their business practices, in the marketplace, and the corruption in government. And his central advice and counsel to the people was exactly our verse in chapter 6. What does God require of you? Do justice, love compassion, and walk humbly with your God. Micah believed that if one was able to do these three things simultaneously, that the corruption and impoverishment of the people would cease, and that a consciousness, a kind of mindfulness, would be created. But it's never as simple as all that. As I said earlier, I grew up in Memphis like your Rabbi Emeritus, Rabbi Walter, and I was heavily influenced by my rabbis, Rabbi James Wax and Rabbi Harry Danziger. Rabbi Wax was president of the Memphis Ministerial Association during that sanitation strike in 1968 that would bring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Memphis, first in February and then again in April of 1968 when he would be assassinated. Dr. Wax, as representative of the Interfaith Association, was called in with Dr. King to try and negotiate a settlement of the strike. At the end of March 1968, there was to be a protest march, but it ended in terrible violence when the police attacked the sanitation workers who marched in silent protest. King left town, and Dr. Wax and the other ministers tried to help the sanitation workers continue to get more meetings with the mayor, but tensions were running so very high. Scott Crossman, who grew up in Memphis, wrote this: Rabbi Wax served as a mediator between the city and the AFSCME labor union, which was seeking to represent the sanitation workers. Because the city refused to recognize the union, all communications were directed to Rabbi Wax, even when both parties were present in the same room. Rabbi Wax focused on 4 key issues: recognition of the union with a contract, a check-off dues system, a grievance procedure, and higher wages. The economic issues seem laughable by today's standards, even if you take into account inflation. New workers for the sanitation department sought a pay raise from $1.60 an hour to $2 an hour, and veterans $2 an hour to $2.25. Issues of overtime and sick leave and vacation pay were already on the agenda. Now, I don't know about Houston, and I assume it was the same in those years. In Memphis, every sanitation worker was an African American. The government were all good old white boys. As the strike wore on into April, Loeb stuck by his no recognition, no work position. And Dr. King returned to Memphis for now a second visit. He did this not only to prompt a resolution, but to show that a peaceful march could take place. Mayor Loeb deeply resented the involvement of local clergy in city affairs. Despite this, he agreed to an off-the-record meeting with Rabbi Wax and Reverend Frank McRae on the Saturday before Dr. King was assassinated. McRae later described this as a meeting of the minds that showed a sign of progress, except that Dr. King was killed on the following Thursday. The day after Dr. King's death, Rabbi Wax led a massive march down Poplar Avenue from St. Mary's Church to the City Hall and engaged in a historical confrontation with Mayor Loeb, which was broadcast on national TV. Father Nicholas Viren from the Greek Orthodox Church remembers the plan as being not a demonstration, but a visit to the mayor's office. But Loeb was gracious in receiving his visitors. Rabbi Wax had his own agenda. Rabbi Viren saw the anger in Dr. Wax's eyes. He tried to discourage him from making the speech that was then called one of the most powerful statements of justice and equality by Reverend Ramsey. With national cameras on him from all three networks, Rabbi Wax stood eye to eye with the mayor and said, "We come here today with a great deal of sadness and, frankly, a great deal of anger. What happened in this city is the result of oppression and injustice, the inhumanity of man to man, and we have come to you for leadership in ending the situation. And there are laws greater than the laws of Memphis and Tennessee, and these are the laws of God. And we fervently ask you not to hide any longer behind legal technicalities and slogans, but to speak out at last in favor of human dignity." Ironically, Rabbi Wax had offered the invocation at Loeb's inauguration just 3 months earlier. Mayor Loeb was a former member of Temple Israel, but had recently joined the Episcopal Church. Though the mayor was the visible bad guy in all of this, he was under immense pressure from the city council and from the attorney's office to defend the city's position. He broke down in tears when he heard the news of King's assassination. This was an example. Dr. Wax's example lived in me always. He lived the words of the prophet Micah, just as Dr. King had lived them as well. Rabbi Wax was not afraid to lead. He was not afraid to walk the path of justice, of loving compassion, to see the humanity in all of God's children. He was a living example to me as my rabbi, as my teacher and my friend, and as a strong influence on my life. He taught me, by his example, to have compassion for all human beings, especially the impoverished, the oppressed, and the downtrodden. He never would have put it this way, but Rabbi Wax lived a life filled with tikkun olam. Now that's a more modern phrase than the prophetic call, the phrase that we use regularly today. Our Reformed Jewish heritage called upon the prophets once long ago to urge us to action, and today we talk about healing and repair of our broken world. But it's interesting to note that tikkun olam, and that phrase, doesn't come from social justice, but rather it is an actual halachic Jewish legal term. It comes from Tractate Gittin in the Talmud. It deals primarily with laws of divorce. It was originally devised, tikkun olam, to protect women in divorce cases. As you know, in the tradition, only men can actuate a Jewish divorce. In the Orthodox tradition, a woman has no power in that. And so the rabbis developed this idea of tikkun olam, of fixing things up in the world, to shield women from unscrupulous and recalcitrant husbands. who would not grant them a divorce. The idea behind it was to improve society. According to Rabbi Gil Rosenthal, the legal principle was expanded from divorce law in a variety of other areas. And so Tikkun Olam then took on a broader meaning, having something to do more than just with divorce. As Rabbi Jill Jacobs teaches us, Tikkun Olam is invoked in response to a situation in which a particular legal detail threatens to overturn an entire system. By invoking the concept of Tikkun Olam, the rabbis fixed the flaw that endangers the stability of the system as a whole. What's the flaw? Only men can enact a divorce. The rabbis were creative. They tried to find a way to fix the system. And that's our legacy. Our legacy is to try and find a way to fix a system that's unjust. A way to fix the system and lift up people. Now, interestingly, the way we use the words Tikkun Olam, which I know you all know, is we use it in a mystical way, which, according to our early reformers, wasn't something that was so much in our old Jewish prayer books. It really comes from the Kabbalistic tradition of Rabbi Luria, the Ari, who would explain the creation of the universe as a repair of the broken vessels that were supposed to contain holy sparks of light, the Nitzatzot. And that light was so beautiful, it shattered the vessels, the 7 vessels, sending the holy sparks of fire into the world and the shards of those broken vessels through the 7 heavens. And so, as partners with God, our task as human beings, as humanity, according to the mystics, is to collect those broken pieces of pottery, to bring together those holy sparks of fire, to release them, and that's how we will make a repair into the fabric of the universe. That tikkun, that repair, is not only outside, but inside each one of us. So these ideas of the prophetic call, of social justice, in which the Reform movement wrote a very first platform in 1918, calling upon our world to do better by immigrants, our world to do better, and by this notion of now Tikkun Olam, kind of brings together the words of the prophet Micah. And it is this combination that continues to guide me in my work for equality for LGBT people. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm old enough to remember when we weren't so open to gay people. Today, we think nothing of it. It's normal. It's regular here in Houston, in this congregation. Rabbi Walter did work to make sure that it was a welcoming and helpful and opening place. But I was ordained at a time when you weren't supposed to be ordained and be gay. And even though I was a product of Temple Israel of Memphis, of Jacob's Camp, Sarah's here, I remember the days before Green Family Camp was around, and all the kids from Emmanuel went to Jacob's, and many friends who grew up in this congregation went to Jacob's in those years. A product of BBYO and Hillel and all the things we want our kids to do, but I knew I had a deep, dark secret inside. I knew I was a lesbian from the time I was 12 years old. And then I spent all of my junior high and high school in Memphis doing every fabulous cotillion and every fabulous formal to try not to have that be the case. And I knew I was going to be a rabbi, but how do you be a rabbi and be a lesbian in a religion that doesn't allow that? Lucky for me, I've not been a very good liar in my life. And so, well, I didn't go around waving pride flags. I also didn't hide so well either. I just went about my business. The business of being a rabbinic student, the business of learning and growing and studying. But I also couldn't keep my mouth shut. I heard Micah in my ear. saw Dr. Wax in my head. And it urged me to begin to speak out, even before I was ordained. And so by 1985, the Central Conference of American Rabbis was already beginning a discussion of the prohibition against ordaining openly gay individuals as rabbis. And even at that time, I wrote then an anonymous letter urging the committee to change the rules. I was ordained at the height of the AIDS crisis, and I came to serve the only pulpit that would have me, as it was no secret that I was a lesbian. I got calls that said, well, we'd love to have you, but we can't have a lesbian as a rabbi. You're very nice, but you know, that's not so good here. And so the only pulpit open to me at that time was Beth Chaim Chadashim, which was the first congregation for gay and lesbian outreach, formed in 1972 in Los Angeles. Those early years of the late 80s and early 90s, for me, were filled with death and pain and suffering. I watched as my congregants, young men my own age, in their late 20s, die without family around. I buried young men in their 30s and 40s who were diagnosed and 6 weeks later were dead. I comforted families who stood by their children, and parents, and watched as other parents swooped in to take in all of the deceased's possessions without regard for their long-time companions. All the while realizing that with each passing day that LGBT people were second-class citizens. And in the Jewish community, as the only rabbi in town who would bury and minister to people with HIV and AIDS, the Jewish community would rather turn its head in shame than deal with its children. I worked very hard in those years with our Reform leadership and edited the very first religious education curriculum ever produced by any religious movement on HIV and AIDS, which was published by our union. My then congregation and I sewed many a Jewish AIDS quilt, piece by piece, in memory of our members and their partners. And I would spend my entire first 5 years as a rabbi going from hospital to hospital to hospital, bed to bed, feeding and touching AIDS patients when the staff would leave the food outside the door. They were so fearful to enter. And that's when I began to ask, so when did we have Jews to waste? Could we afford to lose generations of Jews? And so this became my mantra. This consciousness built on this love, compassion, of doing justice and walking humbly was not only for those who were ill, but for gay men and lesbians who, even in their own synagogue, a synagogue primarily dedicated to the LGBT community, who were so fearful that they never shared their last name. They went by Fred S. or Carol N. What would happen if somebody saw them in temple, in their own gay synagogue? I understood that fear as it had been my own in rabbinic school. And it was that fear that consumed people. And once again, I heard in my ear the prophet Micah calling me. And so I worked hard. Within our conference, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, within our union, then the UAHC, to educate, and to elevate, and to demand that LGBT inclusion become the norm rather than something hidden away. It wasn't just my voice alone, but together with others, courageous lay leaders and rabbinic colleagues, we would try to share a message of hope, and we would organize and sit in meetings for hour after hour trying to change minds and hearts. The gay didn't mean abomination, but that gay men were our sons and daughters, lesbians were our daughters, They were our teachers and even our rabbis. And we all just wanted a measure of dignity. Believe it or not, it was the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, now Women of Reform Judaism, that in 1964 passed any kind of the very first resolution on gay and lesbian equality. They called for the decriminalization of consensual sex between adults in 1964. Now, you in Texas know a little bit of something of that because the landmark case in 2003 was right here for Texas. Lawrence v. Texas struck down all those sodomy laws. A landmark decision in the 6-3 ruling by the Supreme Court. It invalidated sodomy laws in 13 other states, making same-sex sexual activity legal in every U.S. state and territory. But guess what? If you go look at the Texas law, it's right, it's still on the books here. One would have thought that that's enough. That's enough equality to have people stay out of your bedroom. And that's the chant we've heard for years. I don't care what you do, just women stay out of your bedroom. We call it the ick factor. You know, what you do in your bedroom is your business. I don't want to know either. But as the gay rights movement grew in the 60s, something else was happening.